All right, so I'm going to start the presentation now. This class is basically going to give a brief overview of the John Locke essay contest. In this, we're going to discuss some of the psychology concepts or some of the psychology questions in the contest. Um, what we're going to do is first, we're going to give a brief overview of what is required for the essay, what are the exact requirements for the John Locke essay contest. Then we're going to briefly discuss what a research paper is and some of the fundamentals of how to write a research paper, what should be included in the research paper, and what should not be included. Some of this is also going to take from some of the examples that I saw last year when I was reviewing the submissions for the essay contest and some things that you guys can work on. Basically, some mistakes that I saw last time that you guys can hopefully work on this year. After going over and reviewing the actual essay contest, then we're going to discuss the individual essay topics in the contest. There are 3 different potential essays for the psychology section of the John Locke essay contest. We're going to go over a brief overview of what each one of those topics are. I'm going to share what my individual thoughts were when I first saw this question and some of the key findings in psychology that immediately came to mind when seeing the question. I'm going to go over some of the more famous studies and kind of point you guys in the direction of what kind of topics you can research. In each one of these sections, I'm also going to share a list of about 5 to 10 different research studies that you can cite in your paper, and that'll be good places for you guys to go to start your research on this topic. Some of these were specifically used because they were more of a summary essays that really kind of broke this down at a high school or undergraduate college level that I thought could be a really good way or resource for you guys to get a better understanding of what these topics are. Because I know some of these are really complicated topics, especially for undergrads or high school students. All right, and if anytime you guys want to stop me at all, just put something into the comments. I'm very open to hearing what your ideas are and your suggestions are. If you want to comment about anything that you've been writing so far for the essay contest and you want to get my thoughts on what some of your ideas are, don't be afraid to put something in the comments and we can talk about it. All right, so the John Locke essay contest judges you in 4 different criteria. The first is knowledge and understanding of the subject matter. The next is use of evidence. This is one of the really most important parts that I saw a lot of students struggle in last year with the essays. They want to see that you're able to go and do an academic search, that you're able to find peer-reviewed studies of empirical psychological research and properly cite those studies and build an argument based upon that type of research. They want to see a high quality argument that you're really defending the points that you're making, again, using those empirical peer-reviewed studies. And lastly, they want to see writing ability. And importantly, the essay has to be under 2,000 words. These were generally about, say, 3 to 5 pages. All right, so first, as I said before, we're going to overview how to write a research paper. First, we're going to introduce an idea using existing research. Then we're going to form an argument to support the thesis that we kind of provide some evidence for in our introduction. And then we're going to support an argument using existing research. One of the most important parts of any of these projects is, again, being able to do a literature review and find peer-reviewed studies that we can cite in these papers. All right, so first I want to overview one of the previous winning essays. I think this was from 2021 on the topic of isn't all reasoning outside of mathematics and formal logic motivated reasoning. I thought this introduction did a really good job of introducing the main point. So I do want to read it out for you and highlight some points that I think are really important to go over that you guys can kind of copy when you are making your own papers. So their introduction was, when voters vehemently defend a candidate after his or her weaknesses have been exposed, or smokers convince themselves that cigarettes are actually not as bad for them, for their health as they appear, these instances highlight how personal preferences can generally influence beliefs. People have a tendency to reason their way to favorable conclusions with their prolocatives guiding how evidence is gathered. Arguments are evaluated, and memories are recollected. These actions of reasoning are all driven by underlying motivations, including of leading to beliefs triggered with bias that can seem objective to the individual. Motivated reasoning, a phenomenon studied in social psychology, can be defined as a tendency to find arguments in favor of conclusions we want to believe to be stronger than arguments for conclusions we do not want to believe. This concept often contrasts critical thinking, which is generally viewed as rational, unbiased analysis of facts to form judgments at the highest level of quality. In this essay, I will champion a case for motivated reasoning and in turn prove why there is no such thing as good or accurate critical thinking. Instead, all reasoning outside of mathematics and formal logic is essentially motivated reasoning, justifications that are most desired instead of impartially reflect the evidence. All right, so we're going to break down different parts of this introduction. All right, so first off, they did a really good job of introducing the topic. They spent the entire introduction focused really on the main topic of motivated reasoning. The reader knew exactly what the writer was discussing throughout the entire thing. They stayed on topic and they didn't introduce any points yet that might have taken away from the topic. They didn't start talking about something that was unrelated to motivated reasoning that could kind of tie in. They just stayed the entire time on introducing the topic. And I thought that was very important. It's very important to do this in this kind of introduction paragraph to really get the reader know why this is important and why they should care about this topic. I also really like that they used the real world example. They talked about political allegiances and how you might be motivated to, say, defend a certain candidate based on their actions, or say an action of a political candidate was not that bad because you supported that candidate. This is a very applicable real world example that a lot of us, especially in the last few years, have really been experiencing, especially the judges on the panel. A lot of just from being in psychology graduate programs and seeing what a lot of social psychologists care about, there is a lot of this I guess skepticism or curiosity about modern day politics, and kind of bringing this example is a really good way of showing how motivated reasoning is related to a concept that is, I guess, so topical at the moment. They also bring in a really good definition of motivated reasoning by Kunda, who is someone who's written a peer-reviewed study on the topic in this field. I think this is a really good definition of the topic. It also shows that they are doing research and really looking at peer-reviewed studies on the topic of motivated reasoning. Also, really importantly, they end this with a thesis statement, kind of basically showing what argument they'll be making throughout the entirety of the paper. So I worked with several students on this last year, and there were a lot that were like, oh, I don't want to do like the standard high school format. I don't want to do like the standard 5-paragraph thing that they teach you guys in high school, where you write an introduction paragraph, then the 3 supporting ones, and then something at the end, a conclusion paragraph at the end. I get some of the motivation to try to move away from this, and certainly not every published paper is going to be like this. But it still really is important to keep some of the dynamics of this in your paper and at least end with something that clearly shows the reader what you're going to be arguing. There were definitely some papers that I read where I think their argument was a little bit unclear, or they actually did some really good research and went in a lot of different directions, but it kind of was just a little bit all over the place. And throughout it, I was 3 or 4 paragraphs in, and I kind of just started staring at this like I'm not really sure what I'm reading or what point they're really trying to bring together. So I think it is really important to just make sure you stay on topic, and a great way of doing that is to end your introduction paragraph with some kind of statement clearly showing about what you're going to be arguing in this paper. All right, so when we're trying to find things that will actually support an argument, where do we find these articles? I think this is a really important part and something that I think a lot of the students last year did struggle with. So I think a lot of students who are psychology, who want to go into psychology, who have taken some classes in psychology, will kind of first go to their AP psychology textbook or just any kind of general psychology textbook that they have been reading. This might be sort of a good source of information. It's good if you know something about the topic to kind of refer back to a section in your textbook that covered this. However, the internet searches are incredibly important, and I would rather even like start with Wikipedia over your AP psychology textbook, especially if you kind of understand some of the key concepts that are related to the topic at hand. I think it's really interesting to start putting those keywords into even Wikipedia so you can kind of get the overall summary of this research, or start going into Google Scholar, especially after you get some kind of comfort with the topic through reading, say, like the introductory stuff on Wikipedia, which can really be a good way of showing at a very high school level education just exactly what this topic is about. From there, you'll probably get a lot better understanding of what's going on. And then you can go into Google Scholar from there with some of the key concepts that you learned off of Wikipedia. It's also worth noting that in a lot of these Wikipedia articles, they're actually many of them are actually written by academics. Technically, anyone can write that. But if from being in grad school, I know a lot of professors actually do write on Wikipedia in their spare time. And they will also cite different sources. You can go into Wikipedia, click the link at the end of the source, and that will lead you to an academic article. If you like this idea and you want to cite this, you can then cite that academic article that was also cited in the Wikipedia article on the topic. All right, and I actually wanted to use the previous winner as an example of doing exactly this. In that introduction paragraph, as I mentioned before, there was this really good point. There was really good defining of motivated reasoning as its tendency to find arguments in favor of conclusions we want to believe to be stronger than arguments for conclusions we do not want to believe. When looking into this, I actually Googled motivated reasoning, and this was literally in the introduction paragraph of the Wikipedia article on motivated reasoning. And this isn't to say that this student was cheating or should anyway be seen as plagiarism. I think this is kind of exactly what you want to be doing. He is taking this definition and then citing the actual original source. If you clicked on that one link in the Wikipedia article, it would lead you to this Kunda study. This is exactly how you're supposed to be writing a research paper, and he's basically doing everything right here. But just highlighting that this is a really good tool for basing your argument off of. And then this is just showing, so what I would do if I was writing this paper on motivated reasoning, I would go to the the Wikipedia page, which I'm assuming the student also did, get some good information from there, which again, based on the fact that his paper took a direct quote that was also in the Wikipedia article, I think he did exactly that. From there, I would put motivated reasoning into Google Scholar or some of the other concepts. If I found some kind of interesting point or some reasoning behind motivated reasoning, I would maybe put that and some other keywords into Google Scholar. But from there, I would just basically click on all of these, on any of these links that sounded like they're interesting or that sound like they're something that would help my argument. So for a lot of these topics, I also want you guys to try to recognize what kind of articles you should use and what kind of articles you shouldn't. So for me personally, I have a PhD in decision psychology, and I actually work in marketing at the moment. A lot of the research I've done is on behavioral economics and marketing. I don't think using, say, a behavioral economics or marketing journal would hurt you in this kind of a research paper, and a lot of that stuff does include a lot of good psychology research. But it's also important that when you're going through your research study, have a slight preference towards journals that are more psychology oriented. For example, I highlighted that the case for motivated reasoning, the Kunda study that he is citing the definition of motivated reasoning for, is from Psychological Bulletin, which is a well-respected psychology journal. You can also see below this, it says cited by 9,300 other papers. Generally, anything that's over 100 citations is a well-respected article that has gotten a lot of attention. If it's something in the thousands, this is just a very famous study, it means, and something really good to cite. You can cite things with lower numbers of citations, especially if they're key to your argument. But if you're trying to find papers that will give you a better overview of the topic and are more I guess, relevant to the field, the ones that have been cited either hundreds or thousands of times are going to be the best ones, or basically the most famous studies that have had a real impact on the field, and probably some of the stuff that you really should know about as you're writing your paper. All right, so here's one of the supporting evidence paragraphs. I'm just going to read some of the highlighted parts because I think in this he does a really good job of kind of bringing in some empirical studies and explaining how they help his argument. He says in 1992, Ditto and Lopez compared study participants who'd received either positive or negative medical tests. Those who were told they tested positive for an enzyme associated with pancreatic disorders were more likely to believe the test was accurate and discredit the results. And then he says at the end, for instance, a study by Reed and Aspinwall found that women who were caffeine drinkers engaged in motivated reasoning when they were dispelled scientific evidence that caffeine consumption was linked to breast disease. All right, this is a really good job of making different arguments about motivated reasoning. For example, there's an argument in this paragraph that motivated reasoning is evolutionarily used to confront a threat. And then he provides two specific studies, gives a 2-sentence explanation of exactly what those studies found, very briefly describes what the overview of their experiment is, and then explains how that contributed to the overarching result of what he's trying to prove. So when you guys are going through Google Scholar and looking at a lot of famous studies, for the most part, a lot of the research basically a lot of the research in social psychology, which is most of what you guys are going to be looking at based on the topics in this year's psychology essay topics, a lot of it's social psychology, and a lot of social psychology articles have numerous studies that all go into different minute details. Often the guideline for a social psychology paper nowadays is about 6 different studies. For someone's a little bit older, it might be 3. What's important about this is you don't have to say and explain every single study they did in the paper. Just explain one kind of main study and really try to get the point across in about 2 sentences, kind of like what this example did. So just remember, keep it short and to the point so that the reader can really understand exactly what the argument is and exactly how the study supports that argument. And I think for reference, this paper did a really good job of doing that. If you want more references and examples of this, both look at the previous winners and when you're doing your literature review, read the introductions of some of the other papers. They often do a really good job of giving a high-level overview of some of the most important findings in the field and directly how it supports their arguments. From those, you can often kind of take what their explanation is and give about the same explanation for what that study is, even if you kind of don't understand the study or don't understand what the most relevant part of that study is. Moreover, to that extent, when you guys are looking through Google Scholar and reading these different papers, a lot of times you'll see there are 30 pages in very small font. You don't have to read the entire paper. Instead, what I would do is I would really focus a lot on the introduction, especially when they're introducing the main topics, which is a lot of what you're going to be focused on for your paper. When anyone is trying to write a peer-reviewed study, they're normally running an experiment and testing a given hypothesis. Everything they're doing is novel, and they're trying to add something to the established literature. So what they'll do in their papers is they'll normally spend the first, say, 2 to 3 pages really introducing the topic and explaining what's been found in this field. And then most of the rest of their paper will focus on how whatever experiment they're doing adds to the established literature. For your guys' assignment and what you're trying to do in writing this paper for the essay contest is you want to have an understanding of what's been done in the field. So those first 2 to 3 pages where they're really explaining what has gone on in the literature is going to be most important for you guys in understanding what's been going on in the field. And I would really focus on those first 2 to 3 pages of every study that you guys read. From there, for the most part, you can kind of skim through a lot of the methods in the results section as long as you have an understanding of what the main idea in the study is. And a lot of times the conclusion, the beginning will be important and kind of say what they found. but a lot of the second half of the conclusion is basically responding to whatever reviewers have been looking at this paper. So it's not so relevant, especially for a higher level understanding of the topic. It's kind of just checking off boxes that the reviewers listed for them, so that the paper can be accepted into a journal. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is citations and APA style. I saw this mistake a lot, so definitely take note of this and try to understand an exact method for citing papers. There's also a lot of different online resources for how to cite papers, but this is the general basic of how they will go into like your in-text citations. Basically, if it's one author, you just want that author's name with the date, comma, and then the date at the end. It is that simple. You only need the last name. Beyond that, you're fine. If it's two authors, you want to cite both of them and then comma, then the date that the article was published. If it's more than two authors, you want to say the first author's name, et al., and then the year of the publication. Sorry about that. There's a storm and my dogs are barking at it. So at the end, you'll want something a little bit more advanced citations. At the end, you'll want to have a works cited page that includes a full citation for each one of the sources. How you do this is when you are doing your research on Google Scholar, when you are interested in using a paper for the study. For example, if I wanted to use this case for motivated reasoning study, that was using the example. I would then go into Google Scholar. I would hit this cite button in the lower left-hand corner for each individual article. Once I click on that, that cite box will appear, and then I will just copy and paste the one that says APA in it. It is just that simple. It's definitely something that if you don't do correctly, the judges will knock you for it, and it's such an easy way to get extra points on this essay contest. All right, so this is kind of based on some of the papers that I read last year while overviewing the essay contest, and just some of the I guess citations that I wasn't crazy about and would want to avoid. So definitely make sure that a lot of your paper is based on empirical research. What we saw in those motivated reasoning studies was they specifically mentioned an experiment that was performed that supported their case for motivated reasoning and made a point. There was one thing in the introduction that was kind of just a definition, but I would stay away from having anything to support your argument that's not a specific empirically studied paper. Basically, again, by that is just someone actually ran an experiment, they found something, and use what happened in that experiment to defend instead of just someone's quotation. When I looked at these a year ago, there were a lot of basically citing quotes and activities of certain famous people or historical figures, a lot from religious leaders. I think there was some from the Dalai Lama. There were some Bible quotes. There was something from Mark Twain. I don't specifically want to like point anybody out because almost everyone made this mistake. So don't feel bad if you were someone who did, but we generally do want to stay away from those. For one paper that I published, I introduced the topic using a Benjamin Franklin quote. The paper was about employees who were paid hourly seeing their time as money. And then I started the paper with saying that something to the effect of talking about how time is money was at least a concept that has been in the human subconscious for a few hundred years, and using the Benjamin Franklin quote to support that. That's okay as something to just kind of introduce the topic and show that this is something important that people care about. But I wasn't actually using that Benjamin Franklin quote to really defend any part of my actual argument. I was just kind of introducing the topic using this. When you are actually doing anything, all right, so when you're actually writing any kind of paper, just make sure it's focused again on doing real research studies. I just got a comment saying, why should you avoid using famous psychologists? And that's a great question. So last time I'd say about like a quarter of the papers quoted Freud. There's also a lot of other famous psychologists that are covered a lot in the AP psychology textbooks, but not a lot if you're actually, you know, while actually writing real research papers or in psychology graduate school. Beyond my introductory level psychology class, I don't think Freud was ever mentioned. And I will say that a lot of more modern day psychologists don't really respect Freud or much of what he did, other than the fact that he really introduced the topic into psychology, or introduced the idea of going through someone's past and trying to understand their psychology. Um, in general, Freud also did not actually do any empirical studies. What Freud did was he basically acted as a therapist to a lot of people and built ideas about the human psychology based on those. Like, for example, a lot of his work on repressed memories and talking about a lot of things being based on repression were based on just his own observations of people that he was talking to that had these different kinds of basically psychological afflictions that he felt were the result of repressed memories. He never actually did any kind of controlled experiment on this. It's also somewhat problematic that he wasn't really doing a controlled experiment on the population, because basically a lot of the thoughts he have about people basically behaving in very weird and psychotic ways were based on people that were specifically coming to him because they were dealing with psychological difficulties, and those weren't representative of what a normal population was. So a lot of the conclusions that he came up with while talking to these people are obviously biased by the fact that he was only talking with people that were psychologically relatively unhealthy. And it's just also important noting with Freud, it's just among most modern psychologists, he's just not very well respected, and the argument's gonna kind of come up, you know, I don't know. I think it just wouldn't be taken as seriously as if you kind of brought in modern day psychologists that are doing, I guess, more cutting edge research. That being said, though, when I was researching the specific topics for this essay contest, a lot of the first studies that came to mind were like cognitive dissonance was a Fessinger idea that was popular in the 60s. The Ash conformity studies came to mind, and which were also in the 60s, along with the Milgram experiment, which I think was also in the 60s. So it's okay to kind of bring those in because at least they were empirical studies, but I would also supplement that with other more recent topics. Definitely when you're looking through Google Scholar, try to focus on, you can bring in older studies, but definitely at least read some papers from the last few years. That'll give a really good overview of what's relevant in the field now. And just a key word, in your paper, focus on studies that have a clear hypothesis and ran an actual experiment. All right. So getting into the actual topics in this essay contest. And I'm going to go through some of these. I'm going to focus more time on some of the topics and less time on other of the topics. While doing this, don't be afraid to put into the comments what, like, if you are really interested in this topic or have even written something already and have some ideas, definitely put it into the comments. I can respond to any kind of ideas that you have and kind of tell you if you're going in the right direction or not. I'm also going to be sharing some of my thoughts on, if I was doing this, what topics I'd be most interested in or would approach first. Which isn't to say that you should absolutely go in the direction that I would go in, but there's some of these that I absolutely find harder than others, or some that at least I found just way too easy that I would never do it because just the essay would come off really boring. But anyway, so we're going to go into the topics now. The first one is, can happiness be measured? The next topic is, in a survey conducted in the United States, significantly more than half the respondents reported that they believe themselves to be more attractive than the median person in their country. How might we account for this? And then the last one is, are beliefs voluntary? So the first one is, can happiness be measured? So for one, this is the topic that I would most likely want to avoid. When I first looked at this, my immediate answer was yes, you could measure neurological firings in the VMPFC, and that would be my entire paper. I would write one sentence and then I would be done. And I think that would be a really horrible paper. So because of that, I would avoid this one. Just I feel like with neurological arguments, this gets way too easy to just say yes. A lot of people have measured happiness in a lot of different ways using neurological measures. Um, if you wanted to say no, you'd have to kind of focus a lot on the rating scales, which there's a lot of debate about how accurate these are, like how much we really have gone deeper than just asking someone whether or not they are happy, and whether basically everyone's rating their own happiness on the same scale. So I'm not going to focus as much on this one unless you guys are giving me comments about it. But I'm just going to briefly review some of the knowledge I have about rating scales and then point you guys in the right direction if you want to answer this question and focus on the neurological measurements. All right, rating scales. There's a lot of different happiness scales. One of the most popular ones, and the one I'd heard of before kind of researching this, is the subjective happiness scale. And there's a citation for this. I'm also in the same presentation going to show works cited pages at the end of each section. So you can see this exact paper in there that'll focus on this scale. Also a scale that I've used a lot, which isn't specifically about happiness, but there's the Beck Depression Inventory. My master's thesis was on depression and memory, and I basically did a lot of different studies, trying to compare people who are depressed to people who are not depressed, primarily using the Beck Depression Inventory. So the problem with a lot of these scales is they're mostly just 7-point Likert scales where they ask you to rate your feelings about a certain topic on a scale from 1, like absolutely sure, to 7, like strongly agree to strongly disagree. For the Beck Depression Inventory specifically, there was 21 questions. They were all on a scale from 0 to 3, with 0 being the least depressed and 3 being the most depressed answer. They tried to get into a lot of different concepts that were related to depression, but not specifically just asking, are you sad or not? For example, they'd ask something like, are you sleeping more or less than usual? Are you stressed out more or less than usual? However, to an extent, most of the questions, it was pretty obvious exactly what they were measuring. If you put a 0, it meant you were least depressed. If you put a 3, it meant you were the most depressed. It didn't really take any kind of genius to, I guess, rig this to either come off of suppressed if that's what they were looking for, or to come off as happier if they did not want someone to understand they were depressed. In these experiments specifically, I would give them some kind of memory. I would basically give them the depression test, then go through a series of their own autobiographical memories, which are basically memories of your lifetime. Just from talking to them for an hour, there was a lot of people that I can absolutely tell they were depressed. But when actually grading the depression test that they took, they would just put 0 next to everything because they didn't want me to know, or they just, I guess, felt insecure about it. So to an extent, these are only as good as the people that are taking them are willing to be honest and are upfront about their own feelings. There's also a lot of other kind of like biases into these. For example, there's been a bit of research in positive psychology over the last 2 decades about like global happiness and where the happiest countries on earth are. I know that some of the ones that tend to be rated higher, it's now become this kind of like point of national pride. So for example, in Denmark, which traditionally is either like 1 or 2 in overall happiness, now people in Denmark are overwhelmingly likely to say they are happier than they actually are on any kind of scale, because they know this is part of the national pride. They know that these are going to be reported into these like global happiness indexes, and they want to seem happier. Someone doing that and intentionally saying they have these feelings that they don't have will throw off any sort of report on this. And it kind of begs the question of, can you actually accurately measure this if people can so easily lie on these different scales? Another problem for this is everyone's going to have a different baseline for how happy they are. For some people, basically, like if you have someone rate their happiness on like a 1 to 7 scale, for some people 3 is going to be average, or they're going to view 3 as average. For others, they may view 5 or 6 as average. And there's no real way of fully understanding how much their own bias on their baseline levels are affecting what their rating is. So you don't really know, like, if they rate that they're like, if they give themselves a 6 in happiness, is that because they really feel happier than the person who gave themselves a 3, or is that person who gave themselves a 3 just basically using a different baseline? There's kind of no way of doing this other than trusting the people who are reporting their own happiness. So what this is all to say is that if you are choosing this as a topic and kind of saying this happiness cannot be measured, I would really kind of focus on the rating scales and some of the research that has shown a problem with rating scales. Go through Google Scholar and try to find any kind of review articles that seem to have more issues with using self-reports in rating scales. However, in any kind of essay, if you're trying to say that happiness cannot be measured, I think you'd have a problem accounting for a lot of the research on neurological measures, especially in the last 20 years as fMRI technology has advanced. We've really gotten like a lot more neuroscience experiments that have dealt with happiness. So I have a PhD in decision psychology. Um, in my graduate program, there was a lab that specifically focused on behavioral neuroscience, doing a lot of these different studies on reward centers in the brain. They can really see that if you've got, like, basically if someone wins, say, like a small candy bar versus a large candy bar, the large candy bar presumably is this greater reward for them. And they can see different areas of the brain lighting up more when they see something that is a larger reward. They will often use this as a measure of someone is, more rewarded or more happier with a certain outcome based on the light up in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, or the VMPFC, which is what it's commonly called in neuropsychology. When I first looked at this as a prompt, the first thing that came to my mind was this one study where they had participants drink. They had two sets of participants drink different kinds of wine. Some of it was labeled as if it was incredibly cheap, and some of it was labeled as if it was very expensive, but in reality, it was the same wine. What they found was the VMPFC lit up more for those who were drinking the wine that they believed to be expensive than the wine that they believed to be cheap, even though it was the exact same kind of wine. What's important in this study is that these researchers are arguing that they find the wine that they believe to be more expensive as more pleasant, and they are using these neurological firings as evidence that they are getting more basically happiness out of drinking this kind of wine. If I was writing this paper, I would argue that these researchers have used these firings in the VMPFC as evidence of happiness, and would basically defend my argument using that. If you wanted to go down this route, there are a lot of other areas of the brain that have been found to be linked to happiness. A lot of those in the orbital frontal cortex and the prefrontal cortex. There's some argument that most of the happiness literature relates to neuropsychology has focused on more hedonic pleasures, as opposed to something along the lines of like more like physiological happiness, or like achieving one's goals or something like that. However, there's quite a lot of neuroscientists that would definitely argue that they can measure happiness. All right, so I'm going to stop here for a minute. Does anyone have any questions or comments on the happiness question? All right, so I'm going to move on here. And then here is just a list of citations from some of the things that I cited before in this basically section, and just basically use this as a way of starting your own literature review if this is the question you're going with. All right. So the second question. In surveys conducted in the United States, significantly more than half the respondents reported that they believe themselves to be more attractive than the median person in their country. How might we account for this? I definitely like this essay prompt a lot better, and this is one of the ones that I might write a paper on if I was doing this. So for one, what when reading this prompt, I immediately recognize this as the better than average effect, or what's referred to in a lot of the literature as illusory superiority. Basically, this has been studied for the last 40 years in a wide variety of different domains. But generally, if you ask someone if they are better than average at almost anything, they will say that they see themselves as above the average person. This has most famously been studied in driving, and like the specific example that came to my mind first was some of the studies that have done this on driving. I know you guys are probably either about to get your license or maybe just got your license, or you're just driving around with parents sometimes, but you probably have noticed your parents always think everyone else around them is a terrible driver and that they're so much better. Almost everyone feels the exact same way. And they've actually done studies that show that most people will put themselves at about the 80th percentile in terms of other drivers. They've even done this across a series of different driving domains and in pretty much every different driving domain, from like safety to handling to basically anything they can think of. People will see themselves as better than the average motorist. Um, Interestingly enough, when researching this, I found that in the 70s there was it was kind of I guess like a hot button issue about whether people about like trying to get people to actually wear seatbelts more often. And these studies were initially used to explain why posting ads about why you should wear your seatbelt were ineffective, because most drivers thought they themselves would never get in an accident because they were such great drivers, and therefore they didn't need to actually wear a seatbelt. But that's just kind of worth noting on this is that when focusing on this question, they mentioned a lot of different aspects of this. For one, they mentioned attractiveness. They mentioned it being in a US sample and better than other people in the US. What I would kind of focus on here is that this has been found in a number of different domains, including attractiveness. And don't just kind of like hyper focus in on that, like, oh, why do people see themselves more attractive? I think they want you to describe reasoning for the better than average effect just as a whole, as opposed to specifically focusing on attractiveness. And it's also really interesting that they've done studies on this effect where they used just objective knowledge. They gave trivia questions to different college students and found that even those in the bottom 25% of this measure of actual objective knowledge still thought that they were better than half of the students on an actual trivia questions where they knew they were getting the wrong answers. They basically just saw it as, okay, everyone else is, probably struggling with this even more than I am, still seeing themselves as among the smarter people, even though in reality they were quite bad and bad at something that there was an objective correct and incorrect answer. It's also worth noting that there is some findings about the worse than average effect. Basically, if a task is overwhelmingly difficult, sometimes people think that, like, okay, everyone must have had a hard time, or everyone had a hard time with this. Maybe kind of seeing it as like, okay, I am really bad at this. However, that has been debated, and there's been kind of mixed findings on the worse than average effect. But it's worth noting here. All right, so when going through this, you can definitely find a lot of evidence for the illusory superiority effect. However, there isn't really a clear-cut reason for why this is actually happening. Some of it just falls into the general amount of like cognitive biases and how you kind of like distort a lot of the information that you are receiving. There is a wide array of research in decision psychology about different heuristics people are using and how people will have different biases and just basically in general act in very irrational ways. A lot of that will also come into play of them distorting information that they are receiving in a way that benefits them. Basically, one of the more popular ideas is that you will falsely believe that you are better than average just because it kind of makes you feel better about yourself. And you kind of distort a lot of the inputs that you receive throughout your life about your basically any ratings of your performance in a given task, such that you can feel better about who you are and how you stack up against a typical person. One of the other popular reasons that has been tested a little bit is focalism, which is this idea that we tend to focus our attention on ourselves, and then we tend to see that as superior. There's actually a lot of studies that will show that if something is the focus of our attention, we will generally view that thing as more positive. Like for example, if someone's been like in your class year in and year out, you tend to have a more positive opinion of that person just because you're around them longer. It's a little bit of the same effect. Or if you even like, if you stare at a candy bar for longer, you will actually start to have a more positive opinion of that candy bar than one that you're not looking at. And the idea here is that because you're so focused on yourselves and that we're always around ourselves our entire lives, we basically develop this kind of attraction towards ourselves and our own abilities, and that leads us to rate that thing as more superior. They've There's mixed evidence for this, but they've tried to do it in some studies where they will have you focus on, say, another person and try to like compare something else you're focused on to yourself, or take something like a friend and compare the friend to average, and then kind of took away or that like basically we're able to take away the effect by having you focus on someone else. But the evidence for that is mixed. However, this is a really good topic to research and put into Google Scholar and try to find some articles on if this is the essay topic that you want to be researching. The other idea that I kind of thought of that I would try to incorporate into a paper for this is the idea of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a very important concept for social psychology that really started in the 60s, where a lot of social psychology started. Basically, cognitive dissonance is the idea that if we have two conflicting beliefs, we'll distort information for us to alleviate some of the distress that those two conflicting beliefs have caused. One of the more famous kind of ways that cognitive dissonance was introduced was studies on people who were hazed to join some kind of like fraternity or club. Basically, there's a lot of research that shows that if you go through a hazing process, you will have a greater affinity towards that organization than someone who did not go through any kind of hazing process, even though those processes are horrible and they should be banned. But research has found that those who go through these things will feel more connected to these organizations. And cognitive dissonance argues that this is because that we will try to reduce the dissonance by basically having distorted perception of the organization that we joined. So for example, if you're hazing a fraternity, you go through this process, it's terrible. Then once you get there, you realize the fraternity isn't really that great to begin with. You'll start to have this discomfort about like, oh, why did I spend all of my time doing this kind of process when in reality, this fraternity wasn't really that great to begin with. And basically then you'll distort the new information of what the fraternity is to be more positive, and therefore you'll have this more positive impression of what that fraternity is. And sort of in a similar way, we might feel cognitive dissonance towards areas about us that we feel bad about. For example, we really do want to feel that we are a great person, a great human being. But if we are struggling at something like driving, we'll distort our perception of what our driving is so that we can then feel better about ourselves. So when going through this topic, there's just a few things that I would really try to stay away from while you guys are writing your essay. Again, I would not focus a lot on the attractiveness part of the question. This has been found in so many different domains, including, as I mentioned to you guys before, ones where there were objectively correct and incorrect answers. So I wouldn't specifically focus on beauty, and even then, I wouldn't focus on anything related to things that have changed in the last few decades. For example, Instagram, technology, or modern beauty standards. This has been found since it was first kind of being researched in the 80s, and it's generally assumed that this kind of effect was going on before the 80s. I would just generally stay away from how anything about modern technology could be making people feel better about themselves or worse or anything like that. Just because this is such a consistently found study that I think anyone reading this kind of essay would kind of look at it and say that you hadn't done the research and really understand what this effect is. Also, as I mentioned before, this was first discovered in Sweden. There's a lot of European studies that have focused on this. So I wouldn't focus heavily on the US part. I don't know if there's cultural differences between East and West, but I haven't seen anything on it, and I would kind of assume that there isn't. Um, but I would really not focus heavily on the US part and just kind of talk about the better than average effect and what some of the reasoning for that could possibly be. All right, so I'm gonna stop here for a minute. If you guys have any questions, put them in the comment section. Otherwise, I will move on to the last section. All right, so I'm gonna continue. And then again, here are the cited papers. A great stepping off point if you guys want to research this topic. All right, the last one is, are beliefs voluntary? If I was doing this, this is probably the topic that I would stick with, because I think there's just a lot of different articles on this topic, and there's just so many different ways you can kind of dive into the literature. Um, so, are beliefs voluntary is the first thing I thought of is this sort of was a nature versus nurture type of argument, which is really popular in a lot of psychology, just trying to understand like, are our behaviors based on nature, just how we are born in our biology, or are they based on nurture, basically the way we're raised, our experiences, and conditioning throughout society? And when I kind of thought about this and thought into this a little bit deeper, it's like both arguments actually would say that our beliefs are not voluntary. If everything's based on biology, then we should be biologically predetermined to believe certain things over others. If it's more based on our experiences and what we've conditioned to think, it's not voluntary. It's things that were outside of our control that were happening to us as we were being raised, or even as we were adults and being conditioned by our society. There are still things that are outside of our control that are influencing what we believe. Just going into this, like there are studies that'll actually show that, like for example, conservatives and liberals do have differences in their brain chemistry. There's a lot of research on that that would definitely explain that these are more based on biology and not something that we are voluntarily controlling. And then a lot of other things based on see how our conditioning can lead us to believe certain things over others, which I'll get into. All right, so the direction I would go into this was arguing that they are not voluntary based on some of the studies that I'm going to list here. So in studying decision psychology, there's just a lot of different heuristics and biases where people basically behave in really irrational ways. Um, Such as it's very easy to manipulate people into doing certain things over others. Basically, the entire field of marketing is a lot how you can use various small cues to manipulate people into behaving in a certain way. For example, if you're at a liquor store and you're playing French music versus Italian music, you can persuade people to buy more French wines versus Italian wines just because of the music that you're playing. Um, in this kind of experiment, these people are being hit with the stimuli that is outside of their control, and they're involuntarily behaving in the way that you have now basically manipulated them to behave in. Um, there's just so much research on this field kind of showing that we can manipulate behaviors in these kind of ways that I, based on that, say that like believe at some level the way we believe or the way our actions are not completely voluntary. Some of the other interesting kind of articles I found on this or thought up on this was cultural acquisition. A lot of beliefs that are prevalent in our culture are there, and we don't totally understand why, but we believe them anyway. There was one interesting study that tried to kind of show this. What they did was they had five monkeys locked into a room together. They put a ladder in the middle of the room, and there was a banana at the top of the ladder. If any of the monkeys tried to go up and get the banana, the researchers sprayed them with cold water. Um, so eventually, all the monkeys in the room learned that they should not go up the ladder, that they would get sprayed if they did. What they then did was they switched one of the monkeys out and put in a new monkey that didn't know anything about being sprayed with the cold water. When that monkey started going up the stairs, the other monkeys basically pushed him down and made it very clear that he should not be going up there to warn him against being sprayed with the water. So eventually that monkey never really got sprayed with water. He eventually just learned not to go up that ladder. They eventually, one by one, replaced all of the other monkeys with new monkeys to the point where they had a room with five monkeys that had never been sprayed with water. However, all of them knew basically that they should not go up this ladder. And none of them actually knew why they shouldn't go up the ladder because no one had ever been sprayed. And because they're monkeys, they cannot actually communicate to one another that they're going to be sprayed with water if they go up the ladder. So what this kind of shows is that they all basically had this belief that they should not be going up this ladder, though no one even knew why or was consciously deciding that they shouldn't do this. It was basically just what the cultural custom was of that room, and kind of showing how our own society can really mirror that in a lot of different ways. Um, that basically like various things can get ingrained into our culture without us really thinking about it, and then we basically just follow what previous generations do, even without voluntarily deciding that, like, yes, this is part of the culture that I want to accept, or no, this is not part of the culture that I want to accept. So in addition to that, I could again argue that beliefs are not voluntary with cognitive dissonance. Again, we will try to reduce dissonance. Like we have two conflicting beliefs, we'll really try to reduce our kind of negative feelings by distorting one of those beliefs. One example that I thought was particularly related to this one was there was a study where they had all participants do a very boring experiment. I think it was something like stamping envelopes for an hour, just something really tedious and mindless. But then after the experiment, they told half of the participants that they were going to pay them $20 to lie to the next person that was going to be taking the study that this was such a fun task and they were really going to enjoy themselves. The other half of participants, they only paid them $1 and told them to lie to the other participants that this was a totally fun experiment and they were going to have a blast. What they found was the participants that were paid $20 to lie still saw the task as terrible. They completely understood that they were paid $20 to tell this lie. They really hated the task and they only lied because they were being paid $20. And they could use that $20 as justification of like, yeah, I lied, but it was $20 and I wanted the money. However, in the group of participants that were only paid $1, they actually, after the fact, were led to believe that the task was actually indeed fun. They couldn't really reconcile the dissonance between, okay, am I really only lying for $1? That's practically nothing. So they convinced themselves that they actually had a really good time during the experiment. And in that way, basically, their beliefs were essentially manipulated by these experimenters, only giving them $1 versus the other group that had been paid more and had justification for their actions. Kind of just another way of showing that like it is fairly easy to manipulate someone's inherent beliefs. Another finding that I know is very consistent throughout psychology, there's a lot of research showing that parents' political beliefs will strongly correlate with their children's political beliefs. Um, at some level, that part of what your political beliefs are is somewhat voluntary, but like the household you grow up in and the environment you're exposed to is also really going to influence what you believe and what you grow up to believe, which is kind of a way of showing that if there is this connection at some level, it's not that voluntary what you choose to believe, at least politically. Um, there's another study that I thought was really relevant to this was some of the stuff on the conformity effect, and that will kind of do a lot of different things to fit into a group. The Milgram experiment is somewhat famous within psychology. I think probably you guys would have heard of it if you've done an introduction psychology class. But basically, what they'll do is they will have one participant believe that he's applying shocks to another participant in another room that they cannot see. The experimenter will tell them to continue to apply more and more shocks because basically they're answering questions wrong in another experiment. And basically, it's fairly easy to convince a participant to apply a lethal dosage of shocks to a person in another room that they're not seeing. When in reality, of course, there is no other participant in the other room, and that the shocks are basically not actually being delivered. The prisoners are just basically being convinced that they are going through this thing where they're basically shocking someone to death. It's kind of again just an illustration that their belief about how wrong this is can very easily be changed by just having someone in the room telling them that this is okay and that they should be doing this. The Milgram experiment was conducted in the 60s and at the time was used as trying to basically explain how the Holocaust could have happened and how so many people went along with it. And it's kind of just a chilling way of showing that your beliefs can fairly easily be manipulated into doing something that you otherwise would say was horrible if you're just kind of going along with what basically some kind of authority figure is telling you to do. I think the Ash conformity study also fits into this. This is another very famous psychology study that might be being taught in your introductory classes or in the AP psychology textbooks. Um, what the Ash conformity study does is if you look at the table in the bottom right hand corner, participants were in a room with 5 other people who they thought were other participants in the experiment, but in reality were Confederates that were working with the researchers. What they did was they asked all the participants if the line, basically they showed them the line on the left and said which one of the lines on the right is that one closest in length to. Basically, all of the 5 Confederates that were working with the experimenters would say that it is closest in length to line A, which you guys can see from the PowerPoint that it clearly is longer than line A. Once the actual participant in the experiment heard the other 5 people all say the incorrect answer that it was line A, they themselves would most of them would then respond that line A was the correct answer, even though they could clearly see it was not actually line A. About 50%, about sorry, 75% of participants would at some point give the wrong answer. Many of them after the experiment reported that like, oh, they didn't really believe what they were saying. They just wanted to go along with the group. However, quite a large subset of them actually did end up believing that A was indeed the correct answer just because of what the other people were saying. Again, kind of showing that your beliefs are heavily influenced by the other people around you and not completely voluntary in that sense. I also feel like if you want to go down this pathway, there is definitely an evolutionary argument to this. For example, like human beings have very similar phobias across the population. We're generally afraid of things like snakes and spiders or heights or things that can actually really kill us. Whereas things like bunnies, no one is really that afraid of because it's not something that we really evolved to be wary of about being dangerous. I think you can kind of make the argument that like say our belief in like snakes being harmful is not actually voluntary. It's more something that's been ingrained in us through evolution. All right. So for this question, I tried to make some arguments for why your beliefs are voluntary. This isn't really the direction I would go in with this, but this was just some of the things that I thought of. A lot of this doesn't have citations. You guys can definitely look through some of this and try to find some things that'll um like help you with this, but it's kind of just some general thoughts of studies and stuff and some like research, I guess, that I've heard in the past that might contribute to this. So this is hard to, yeah, as I'm saying before, this is really hard to make using just empirical psychology studies. However, in all of these studies, they're not exactly 100% of participants don't basically fall victim to the manipulation. Like for example, in the Milgram experiment, 35% of the participants generally don't shock the respondent to a lethal dosage. based on that, you can kind of say like, okay, so some beliefs are involuntary, but clearly these 35% of people are in some way voluntarily saying that like, no, I think this is wrong. I won't do this. Basically, they must be holding some sort of beliefs that cannot be manipulated, and therefore you can make the argument that those are voluntary. You can also voluntarily change your own beliefs. Like there's a lot of research on like classically conditioning yourself to make yourself do a lot more healthy behaviors. Especially a lot of modern psychology research has really focused on just different ways that you can use psychology tips and tricks to kind of help yourself. Like for example, there's a lot of different things about like rewarding yourself for not smoking or for doing different kind of behaviors that'll help you like rewarding yourself for working out and various things you can do in this sense. So I would try to look into like some of the self-help psychology stuff to try to find ways that you can kind of manipulate your own thoughts and feelings to like kind of change your beliefs in certain ways. However, um this whole section was a little bit half-hearted because I would clearly argue that your beliefs are not voluntary. All right, and here is the general works cited page on everything that is related to beliefs being voluntary or not. All right, that is all I have on this. Before I leave, does anyone have any comments, questions, or anything on their own papers that they want to discuss before ending the presentation? All right, if no one has anything, I'm going to end the lesson now. Best of luck with writing your papers. Also of note that I can start looking over these at any time. It's a lot harder to make adjustments if they're sent directly before the deadline. Anything that's sent even a couple of weeks before, I'll have a lot more time to go over these and try to make larger comments that can really steer the papers in good directions. So in general, good luck to you all on writing the papers, and I look forward to reading them. Oh, I got a question actually from my email. I'm gonna type it in the chat. It is dfalco46@gmail.com. And I believe Betty can give you all my information if you guys need it. All right. Thank you all and have a good night.
Thank you.